really drives me crazy when people, even actual neuroscientists, go around saying that dopamine is pleasure because it clearly isn't. And we've known this for like 15 years and they're still going on about like, oh, dopamine, it's so fun, and like dopamine kids and all this. And it's like, no, like that is not how it works at all. But what dopamine does seem to be involved with is making you want more. And sometimes that is pleasant and sometimes that isn't.
Welcome to the Repatterning Podcast, where we believe your mind-body system is your domain and that choosing the beliefs, habits, and patterns that best support you is your birthright. I'm your host, Arden Lee, creator of the Repatterning Project, an 8-week course in learning to free yourself from the patterns of your past and program your mind for your dreams of the future. Join me for these extraordinary conversations as we unpack the keys to creating our reality. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Repatterning Podcast. Thank you so much for being with us today. And if you're enjoying these conversations, I do want to remind you before we get started with today's episode that you can support us on Patreon for as little as $5 a month. And that does give you access to our private Discord channel. So come find us at patreon.com/the Repatterning Podcast. And with that out of the way, I am so excited, you guys, about today's guest, Maia Szalavitz. Maia, I have been fangirling over you ever since, I'm probably dating myself with this, but ever since I read your article in Elle magazine about Kent Berridge's research on dopamine. And I'm so excited to ask you, like, there's been so many things that I've, like, ever since then that I wanted to ask you and talk about. And so let me introduce, for any of you who are listening who are unfamiliar, Maia Szalavitz is an acclaimed author and journalist in the fields of neuroscience, addiction, drug policy, and recovery. She is the author of several books, including her most recent book, Undoing Drugs, and my favorite book, Unbroken Brain, which I have my copy of here. And as you'll see, it's like got all these underlinings and stars. It's all, I must have read it like at least 3 times already. It is Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction. And she's also the author of Help at Any Cost, which is a book that takes a look at the troubled teen industry. So I'm excited to talk about that a little bit today too. She is a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, and her work has also been featured in Time Magazine, Scientific American, and The Guardian. Maia, thank you so much for being here with me today. I am so excited to talk with you about these subjects.
Thanks so much for having me. By sheer coincidence, I was speaking with Kent Berridge yesterday for something that I'm working on.
No kidding. Oh my God. Well, now I'm curious. Can we start there? What are you working on with Kent Berridge?
Sure. So I'm working on a piece for the Times about AI and addiction, and it has to do with wanting and liking. And it was so funny when I interviewed him for that Elle piece. He was so excited because I think he had a teenage daughter at the time, and she was just like, that was more impressive than a lot of his scientific publications. But he's lovely, and I'm always interested in the work that he's doing. So it was good to catch up with him.
I'm so curious about, so I guess the first thing to do is probably unpack a little bit about that research that he did on dopamine. And I know for me, when I read that article, what struck me was basically the understanding that liking and wanting are driven by there's two separate drives in the brain. They're not the same thing. So you relate this to drug addiction in particular. But when I read that, I remember relating to it with my relationship with my then partner, because I was like, I have to be around you. I'm so anxiously attached. I didn't know what anxious attachment was back then, but it was like, but now looking back at it, I was so anxiously attached. I was like, oh my God, I can't stand to not be with you, but I can't stand to be with you either. Like, it's this idea that as our cravings increase, our actual enjoyment of the thing that we're craving can decrease. And this blew my mind at the time. I was like, how do I even like be in relationship if that's how this works? So yeah, unpack a little bit about that. And I'd love to know how that intersects with AI.
Sure. So basically in the brain, and Kent Berridge was one of the people who sort of elucidated the way this works. But in the brain, there's sort of 2 kinds of pleasure, you might call them. And sometimes they're not actually pleasurable, but we'll get into that in a minute. So there is wanting, which another person that I cite in the book called the sort of the pleasures of the hunt, right? And so that's about like, oh yeah, I'm going to get this. I'm psyched. Like I am, on top of the world and I can do anything. And I'm the cat who's definitely getting the mouse, right? So that is wanting. And wanting can be pleasurable because like, watch the cat enjoy the chase, right? But infinite wanting is bad because if it's not satisfied in sex or anything else, it is no fun, right? And liking is the other piece. And so you can compare that to what poetically is called the pleasures of the feast, where you've caught your whatever and you are sitting down to eat and it is all good. You can also think about this in sort of more crude terms as like desire versus orgasm and afterglow, right? And it's important because what can happen, and some of Berridge's more recent work has actually looked at this, is you can want something that you really don't like anymore. And he has actually trained rats to sort of want pain. Um, and so that's
I
kind of
can relate to those rats, actually.
that's, I mean, I suspect we all can. And yes, these are sort of the techniques of the bad boyfriend. And you really, and so in relation to I was looking at it sort of, so if you think about it for with regard to drugs first. So wanting is kind of like the stimulant experience, like cocaine or methamphetamine, where again, you just feel like very powerful and you want something and you're going to be able to get it and it feels great. And so that's the sort of early stage wanting where it's pleasure. And drugs like opioids and alcohol are sort of, they simulate more the liking and the satiation of desire. And so, again, if you want to look at it sexually, the desire part is one thing, the climax and after that is a different thing. And if you have the first without the second, it's often not very fun. And so you can, and I did, end up really, really wanting something that I didn't like anymore. And this becomes really acute with cocaine. And this seems to be driven by the way dopamine works in the brain. And so it really drives me crazy when people, even actual neuroscientists, go around saying that dopamine is pleasure because it clearly isn't. And we've known this for like 15 years and they're still going on about like, oh, dopamine, it's so fun. And like dopamine kids and all this. And it's like, no, like that is not how it works at all. But what dopamine does seem to be involved with is making you want more. And sometimes that is pleasant and sometimes that isn't. And as you get addicted to something, a person, an activity, an AI, whatever, what happens in the brain is that the region where dopamine is activated shifts over time. And it goes from an area where you are sort of consciously wanting something and you like wanting it and it's all right to an area where it's kind of automated and the desire is just kind of built in and your actions become sort of less voluntary around that wanting. And for me, this really happened very clearly with cocaine. And so I would be just crazily wanting it because I wanted to achieve that sense of, things are all right. I could do it and I'm going to get what I want. But what I would get towards the end, when I was like shooting up dozens of times a day, what I would end up with is anxiety and paranoia and fear and shaking. And like, I knew before I injected the Coke that this is what was going to happen. And yet I could not stop myself from doing that. And it was just a maddening, horrifying experience. And this was, eventually led me to get into recovery, basically, because when you desperately want something that you don't like, it's awful. And, so many people think that, oh, people with addiction are just having so much fun and you need to kick them in the butt to make them get better because, like, they're having so much fun, they would never stop. And it's like, no, not fun at all. This is really not fun. You try having infinitely escalating desire and it not being satiated. Would you really think that was fun? you
Yeah,
know,
seriously.
so, but anyway, the dissociation between these two experiences is really important. And this is again what drives me crazy about the oversimplification of dopamine, because dopamine really does seem to be involved in the pleasure of wanting, but not so much in the pleasure of liking. And the pleasure of liking seems to be more opioid mediated. And so if you think about the way stimulants versus depressants act, like stimulants are, exciting and up and getting you doing stuff, and depressants are calming and mellow. And that's what the opioids in your brain are sort of there for. They are there to calm the stress system and to allow you to chill and to feel safe, warm, loved, and comfortable. And when people don't get that in their lives or are missing the sensation of that, opioid drugs become obviously especially attractive. And so this is why when like Johan Hari puts it, like, the opposite of addiction isn't recovery, it's connection. And I think this is true. It is also more complicated, but it is very true that a lot of the times what people with addiction are looking for from their substances is a feeling of being wanted and loved and okay and, not hated. And when you are actively addicted, you do not feel these things very often. And at first the drugs give them to you. And I mean, one of the real differences between opioids and, say, a drug like cocaine is that even when you are very deeply addicted to opioids, they still work. It's not like you take the opioid and you get the opposite effect that like happens with stimulants. What happens instead is you take it and you feel okay, but you're not really getting to that kind of amazing euphoria of okayness that you used to get to. But it's not like you actively, and this is actually, I was speaking with Ken Berridge about this because one of the challenges to his theories around addiction and wanting and liking is that, like, opioids don't produce that kind of very sensitized wanting in as explicit a way as the stimulants do. So one of the challenges to his idea about the way addiction works is that opioids don't produce as pronounced a dissociation between wanting and liking as stimulants do in later stage addiction. And so you could make the argument that, like, oh, this means that this does not apply to opioid addiction, but it does. It's just not, the dissociation is just not as extreme, at least in my view, and at least in his view of the way the literature looks.
And from my understanding too, and in my experience, we can build a tolerance to nearly anything. Like for me, it's kind of funny that I'm such a fangirl of your work and I've never experienced what anyone on the outside would look at as addiction. I've never had a problem with substances. I didn't start using substances until I was really like kind of in my late 20s, and by then, I was able to kind of find, the sweet spot in, I mean, yeah, I might have had a night or two that was, but for the most part, it never became a habit. And I picked up your book in early 2017 because I was in love with someone who was struggling with addiction. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was definitely codependent and was one of those, like, let me figure out what your problems are. And I started reading it, and all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, this also describes me. Because what you talk about when you talk about addiction as a learning disorder is, and this has become, I've sort of paraphrased your concept of addiction to come up with my own definition of it, is I've started to call it that addiction is a pattern we have overlearned beyond its usefulness. Because
Yeah.
when we start out, like if it didn't work the first time, we wouldn't do it again. But then we do it again and again, and we build up that tolerance, like we were saying. And so for me, as someone who's never been addicted to a substance, at least in any overt kind of a way, I still very much recognize myself in the pages of these books because there are certain things in my life that, again, I would crave more. You need more and more and more of the thing to be satisfied.
Yeah, and I mean, this is fundamental to how you learn anything, because what we do is, like, if everything remained new, we couldn't learn it because it would be new all the time. So we wouldn't recognize that it's familiar. And so making something from new and scary into safe and familiar is basically going to tolerance. It's going from, sort of being sensitized, like, oh, this is new, I'm a little scared, to, oh, yeah, I know this, it's fine. And so, but in order to learn anything, you kind of have to be in that sweet spot where you're not overwhelmed by the newness, but you are a little bit out of your comfort zone so that you can notice the novelty, incorporate the novelty, and then you have learned, okay, I understand how to deal with whatever this thing may be. So we couldn't learn without tolerance. And it is sad that, like with drugs, for example, you get tolerant to the liking and the good feeling and not to the wanting and the sort of desperation of craving. Like that escalates because I mean, you could imagine a situation where the drug would, if you didn't get tolerant to liking, the drug would just get better and smaller doses. And
Right.
drug dealers would
If
be out of,
only.
but we couldn't learn anything because we would just be in this little bliss, right? So, there is a price to pay, and I guess it kind of goes back to like the tree of knowledge or something. But anyway,
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the tree of knowledge too, because I was thinking about your research and specifically about building tolerance. And I was thinking about applying that understanding to my magic practice recently, because magic it's that same kind of dance of wanting and liking, because when you cast for it, an intention, whatever you're doing, you put that intention out there, you cast that spell, you do that ritual, whatever it is, and you're in that like, oh, I want this thing, and then you get it, right? And you get it, hopefully if your magic works, right? But then it's like you have to really watch and make sure that you're not over learning that pattern to where nothing is satisfying you. And I'm noticing, like, because, and I'm autistic, as you are as well. So, as you talk about in the book. And also by the way, your book also helped me to learn that I was autistic too. So thank you also for that. But yeah, noticing that pattern and thinking like, "Oh, this could get dangerous for me. I could get to a place where I have the entire world at my feet and yet nothing is
yeah.
satisfying to me." So I guess I'm curious, how do you or how do we make sure to, I mean, partly I suppose it's like it's moderation, but how do we also make sure that we just in living our lives or in going about the things that we want to achieve, that we're not desensitizing ourselves to the very things that we set
Yeah.
out on that path for?
I mean, I think like the only way to manage that is to just keep learning and to keep challenging yourself and to, there are sort of pleasures that are kind of easy, like drugs, if you're not addicted, that, you just take this, it works, and it doesn't require effort or learning, right? But if you try to learn a complex system, music, like which is I am struggling with and trying at the moment. And whatever it may be, like a sport, dance, art, writing, whatever it is, like or loving people, connecting with people, all of those things, you have to get into that same kind of sweet spot where you're a bit challenged, but you're not like overwhelmed. And I think people on the spectrum, we sensitize really easily, which is why we tend to want like repetition and sameness and avoiding novelty sometimes. Um, so, there is a balance to be had there because if you get overwhelmed, especially if you have, anything that gives you difficulty regulating yourself, that can be problematic. So you need to sort of stay far enough out of your comfort zone to be challenged, but not so far as to be like overwhelmed. And I think I've been thinking lately, like so much of life is just about like trying to stay in that spot where you are still learning and there's good novelty and you are engaged, but you are not overwhelmed. And I think like one of the goals that I had with that book is to have people understand that addiction is not this crazy alien thing that like people who don't have it can't understand. It is basically what it is like to be in love with something or someone. And when that happens, you get, your motivations change and you get craving and you get attached to that person or thing. And if it's a helpful, productive thing, that's great. Now you get married and have kids or whatever the version of that is for you. But if you are, addicted to an AI or um, a person who's bad for you, or a drug that's bad for you, then you end up in that compulsive behavior despite negative consequences state, and the coping that you got from it doesn't really work that well over time anymore.
Yeah, I actually, speaking of that, I would love to read my favorite quote from your book, which is the same thing that distinguishes addiction from passionate interest also divides unhealthy love from that which is the highest experience of humanity. That is, love is real when it expands and enhances your life, and troubling and problematic when it contracts or impairs it. Whether you love a person, a drug, or an intellectual interest, if it is spurring creativity, connection, and kindness, it's not an addiction. But if it's making you isolated and dull and mean, it is.
Thanks. Yeah. No,
That's my favorite paragraph.
sometimes you hear your old stuff and you cringe, but I was very pleased with that one. So the
That is like I want it on my tombstone.
but yeah, no, I mean, I really think that that is the core of it, and I think a lot of times people mistake addiction and dependence, and they think that, like, if you need something or someone to function, there's something wrong with you, and we're all interdependent. People on the spectrum need people just like anybody else does. It may be in a different way and in a different amount, but it still is the case that, like, our stress systems, the reason we have those opioids in our stress systems is so that a mom can comfort a baby, or a lover can comfort the partner, or we can comfort our friends. Like, our stress systems are designed to be mellowed out by kind social contact. And, you can see this physiologically. It doesn't matter if a mom is like holding a 3-year-old or if she's like 90 and her daughter's 70. The blood pressure of both of them is going to go down when if they are in supportive relationship, because we can also mess with each other. But if they are, then we are soothing each other's stress system. And, we often think of yoga or running or whatever for soothing your stress system, but we're designed for it to be through relationships. And that means we are interdependent. And it doesn't mean that, like, yoga or running or whatever works for you physical wise is bad. It just means that without, loving social support, we can't be healthy. And again, different doses for different people, different ways of achieving that for different people, but it is still fundamental. And so if we think that, like, oh, being dependent is codependent, or if we think that if you need something too much, there's something wrong with you. No, if you need something that's hurting you or somebody else, that's a problem. But if you just need, someone in order to be healthy, that's being part of the human race. Again, that doesn't have to be a romantic partner. It can take many different forms, but, you know, being a hermit is just not healthy.
Yeah. And what I love especially about what you unpack in that quote too is that I think for me, for a very long time, my own weakness was like in neurolinguistic programming, they have that concept of like chunking down or chunking up, like, where chunking down is like to focus on the details. And I would do that. I would get so narrowly focused on, every last little, it's like the same thing that I do when like, if you have like a zit or something and you're like, oh God, I gotta get this zit. And then you back up and you're like, oh, now what was a tiny speck on my face is now like a giant crater when I back up and look in the mirror. So like the chunking up being like the backing up and looking in the mirror. And for a long time, I was very incapable of doing that in my own life, that sort of zooming out and seeing the full picture of it. And so that ability to really take a greater perspective and say, is this actually working for me? Is the thing that I'm doing working? And that really, like, much, thanks to your work, thanks to like the body keeps the score and attachment theory and things like that, that really is what I created the repatterning project out of, was realizing that I have these underlying needs. And like you talk about in the book, you talk about that addiction is not so much the problem in itself, it is a bad solution to an underlying problem. And so whatever that underlying need is legitimate. It's the fact that I'm doing something that I think somehow in my head is going to work because maybe it worked once, or maybe it worked inconsistently. We can talk about like Skinner and the pigeons and the intermittent reinforcement that like if something works inconsistently, there's no better way to get a human being or a pigeon or whoever, to repeat that behavior, which feels so illogical when you zoom out and think of it that way.
It also makes sense in sort of light of the fact that like no human being is going to be perfect at providing the reinforcement that you want. You know what I mean? And like
That's a good
it,
point.
this is really adapted for like love and parenting and friendship, like any kind of social thing, because like nobody can meet anybody's needs perfectly. And if we only learned from 100% consistency, we wouldn't learn anything. So, in order to, there's a reason we get trapped by intermittent reinforcement. We have to be careful not to let commercial interests use that against us. But in terms of, and also like bad boyfriends or girlfriends, but there is a reason that that sort of hard to get or inconsistency like is attractive. And it is not necessarily bad in and of itself. It is only bad in a context.
Yeah. I'm wondering also, I wonder if there is a way for two people to have a secure relationship and sort of like microdose that inconsistency in a way that's actually healthy and consensual to keep things, because there is that classic sort of thing about, oh, the person who's always there I'm not interested in, but the person who's, messing with me or whatever is very interesting to me. And I think about this a lot. Like, are there ways for two people to basically understand, like, okay, if this is kind of how our brains work, can we infuse
Yeah.
this relationship with, with
Or
something that's going to keep it a little more exciting?
Esther Perel speaks of this a lot, where like the book Mating in Captivity, where it is.
Yeah, I love her work too.
And so I do think that we have a love for novelty and a love for sameness. And those are obviously in conflict with each other. So it is never going to be perfectly encapsulated. But yes, like I think keeping some sense of mystery and doing new things with your partner, like, one of the things like my husband's really into like we do dance lessons and it's like scary, but like, it's fun eventually. Eventually I get slightly better. But it's like is again, it's like that bit of challenge and, also like something that is just inherently enjoyable, like moving to music. Yeah, like keeping like having some kind of adventure within your relationship like that, I think is good. And he's also really into kayaking, which I like to do the boring kind of kayaking and he likes to do the challenging kind and that's fine. But it's just like, yeah, you have to like work within each other's risk tolerances, basically.
I'm curious also, you mentioned earlier about learning music. Are you open to sharing about what you're doing with that?
I'm sure. So I'm like attempting to learn to sing and learn music theory. And so, I have a pretty okay voice. It is really interesting to like kind of try to learn how to actually use it and to learn four part chords and harmonies and like scales and all of these kinds of triads, whatever. So I'm really enjoying it. I was just in between this, was just like trying to play these chords terribly, but like I'm really learning like how it works. And I love music so much that it is like I just can like sit there for hours listening to things and I can hear things that I couldn't hear before. And it's just really amazing. And so, it's just something that like I always loved. And, in high school, I had a friend that we used to sing together and she is back in my life because she's moved back to our area. And so we are going to do some more music, which is great. But yeah, so it's just like, one of those things that like I always like wanted to be able to do more and know more about, but that I really, didn't have the time or energy to pursue when I was kind of trying to get my career to work. So it's been super fun. And I mean, one of the things like that music I think is really interesting is that like it really works on like your brain sort of trying to predict the next thing. And so you're like, you have the form of Western music in your head because you've just listened to it all your life. And so you're expecting certain things, which music theory can tell you what they are. But there's also more creative ways of doing those things that if you predict it, but it's actually better than predicted. So that like makes you happy. It's like what they call a positive prediction error. And this is dopamine seems to be involved in like prediction error to some degree. A negative prediction error, this is why disappointment sucks because you not only did you not get the reward that you predicted, now you're punishing yourself for like having made a wrong prediction. Positive prediction error, on the other hand, is great. And so you're listening and it's like, oh, I think the next going to be this. And oh, it's that, but that's even better. And so it's like, I don't know. I'm just really enjoying it. And it's really, yeah, I mean, I think everybody has like some kind of art or physical activity, music. There's just something that you love in the world that can be a craft or a practice. And it's infinite what you can learn about music. I mean, it's just, you can't even possibly listen to all the good music in the world. So it's great. And this does give you you always have something to like look forward to. And yes, like you're going to suck for a while, but oh well.
That's so cool. Yeah, I'm also a singer, and I write music too. So I'll just put it out there officially whenever you're ready. For Arden and the Wolves featuring Maia Szalavitz, fly out to LA. We'll write a song. We'll figure it
Oh,
out. But yeah, I love for that reason. I'm a big fan of switching up my lyrics on the second chorus because you've heard the first chorus the first time and you think you know what's happening, and then like you get maybe like like that third line, that A B, right? And that third line, you switch up the lyrics a little bit and you kind of throw something in there, and it's like it's so satisfying to my brain. But then of course I can't do that in every song because then it becomes too
right.
predictable.
Right. And then, I mean, then you've got to deal with a bridge at some point. So,
Oh, bridges are like my favorite part of a song because I feel like the bridge is like when you drop in and you really get real with what you're saying, because it's like the point in the song where like it's exactly what you're speaking of. That pattern changes, it's
yeah.
verse chorus, and then all of a sudden it's the bridge, and it's this opportunity. I feel like in a lot of songwriting, I feel like the thing that is really being said in the song kind of happens in the
Yeah.
bridge.
Yeah.
Like that's
Yeah.
the
Well,
part where
and
you're getting
you
honest.
have to modulate correctly to whatever key is going to actually work, which I don't know very much about yet. And I think like, right, the hardest parts and the best parts are the transition.
Yeah. Also, I know that music and dopamine interact quite a bit. And I remember when I realized it was like, I guess about 5 years ago, I realized that I had ADHD because I didn't have the typical signs of ADHD. I was a dissociative daydreamer. I was not like the restless, hyperactive kid when I was growing up.
In other words, you were a
So
girl.
yeah, exactly. Yep. I was socialized female, and autistic at the same time. But I remember when I realized that like my addiction to crushes was basically serving my dopamine deficiency, because I realized around this I was like, "Oh, this is why like when I have a crush on someone I feel like, oh, I'm going to do all these things and I'm going to, and I feel so alive." And then like when I don't even have to be with a partner. I just have to have an interest in someone. Like I have to have like a plan, And when I don't have that, it'd be like, I'd be like home from college break or whatever, like walking through the mall with my mom. And it'd be like the difference between like, I'm going to wear this to that party, and, versus like, this is just all a bunch of capitalist junk and everything is pointless. And
Well, yeah. And I mean, like that kind of anhedonic state is really, really difficult to manage. And I mean, for me, sometimes that actually, I have a baseline of medication that I need to like not go there. But it is like sort of, I find like the link between like music and motivation and dopamine, because dopamine like is not just about prediction or wanting, it's also movement. And so like motivation and movement are like inherently linked, not just linguistically. And right, it's like when you have that like sort of good aspect of dopamine, the sort of wanting, the confident wanting, then right, you're just in it. But when you don't, and when you have no sort of special interest or special person that is like driving that, then, it can be very hard for people like us.
Yeah. Yeah. So there I was, it's like 2021 and I was in this stretch of time because it was also the pandemic was happening and I was in like my longest stretch of like going without a crush, like just without any romantic interest whatsoever. And I was so like, you know, and I remember like when it finally clicked for me what this was. And it was because I remember I had done magic about it. Like there was a person who I just like couldn't get out of my head and like the last person that I'd had a crush on and it was like I really need to like let go of that whole situation. They moved across the country and everything. And so I cast a spell to like rid my mind of them. And it was like less than 24 hours later, I remember seeing some posts on like Facebook or something like that. And it was stuff about dopamine. It was stuff about like, for whatever reason, whatever it was, it clicked for me. I was like, oh, this is the thing. I have a dopamine deficiency. This is what is serving this. And so, of course, I started looking up like, all right, well, what are some natural sources of dopamine or whatever? And here I am, and I'm in the middle of making this album at the time, et cetera. And one of the things was like, oh, well, listen to music, and I was like, but I think actually in some ways, writing music, it's that same process of like you start writing a song and it feels so amorphous and every time I'm writing I'm like every other success I've had was a fluke. I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm like everything that's coming out of my brain is just mush, like forget it. And then you get a foothold and you finish it and then it comes out and it's this process. And I think for me like finding that has also been that source of dopamine that I'm doing something, I'm completing it and then it's out there and it's done. But I'd be curious, like, what else you think is the relationship between music and dopamine? Like, for those of us who are dopamine deficient, like,
Yeah.
how do you think that music serves that?
Well, I mean, I do think that because it is like a pattern of repetition, that your brain is just happy to predict it. And like that, like, sort of motivates you. And you know, you might want to dance, you just feel the emotion of the music like moving you. And that I think it's slightly different, like playing or like creating music, but even just listening, if you're really into it, you will be like engaged in that. And like we love to have patterns that are just predictable enough. Like, and again, it's that finding that sweet spot there, but that's what good music does for you. And I mean, I don't know about you, but like I will listen to something a zillion times. Like if I fall in love with songs all the time and like I will just listen to this thing to death and I will still really like it later, but it's just like I feel like I'm learning something from it somehow. And then once I've learned that, I've kind of incorporated it and I still like it, but it's not like that, like I must hear this again kind of thing that happens when I'm just like really sort of engaged in trying to understand something musically. So I think it's all of those things. And I think, we do get a fundamental pleasure from curiosity and learning. And I think, especially like people who might have some dopamine deficiency or whatever you want to call it, you would be especially drawn to that because that combination of novelty and predictability is giving you a sense of competence.
Yeah, I love that. Switching topics, but I wanted to make sure that we covered this also as part of this episode. I'm really also curious about your work looking into the troubled teen industry, and I'll be transparent. I have not yet read Help at Any Cost, although now that it's on my radar, I I really want to. But some of what my work has dealt with is. I never intended to create the repatterning project. I was a theater major at NYU. I intended to be a performer, and yet having to sort of solve these problems that came up for me and that have come up for others has given me a sort of dual sense of purpose now in my life. And so much of what I deal with is the shortcomings of the mental health industry. And the look on your face for anyone who's not watching the video, for anyone who's listening to just the audio of the podcast, Maya's face was priceless when I just said that. And and ending up working with people especially who have been failed by other sectors of the mental health industry and looking also at especially at mental institutions and places that are supposed to care for people and they're actually doing more harm. In the last season we had
Our, yeah, our,
yeah.
our, first of all, like For kids, we have zero good mental health care. I mean, almost zero. Even the richest people in the country can't like find decent care. This is how you have like Paris Hilton ending up being a spokesperson for the harms done in the troubled teen industry because she was getting sent to basically the same place that the Medicaid kids were getting sent to. Uh,
Mm,
and it is astonishing how bad it is. Like I have a friend right now who's got a kid who's dealing with some of this stuff, and it's just like we just do the stupidest things, and even the, like, most professional people in the area sometimes do incredibly stupid things around pharmacology, and, it's crazy. So the Help at Any Cost was basically the first investigation into what I label and the survivors label the troubled teen industry. And what that is a group of residential facilities or wilderness programs, emotional growth boarding schools, Christian programs. There's all kinds of different ones. But fundamentally, the thing that marks the troubled teen industry is that the abuse is the treatment.
yeah.
And the idea is we will break you to fix you. And this comes out of a lot of really literal cults that also came to dominate the adult addiction treatment system in America. So
Yeah, I wanna talk about, like, rehabs as well because I know
yeah.
you've had also experience yeah, all of
So
that.
famously, there was a cult called Synanon, which was founded by a guy in AA who thought that AA wasn't tough enough. And so they ended up having these very confrontational and humiliating encounter group kind of things where, they thought they were getting real and honest by being really mean to each other. And the thing about it is that when somebody treats you cruelly, we have a sort of natural instinct to think, that wasn't meaningless. I deserved it. Or that wasn't meaningless. That helped me. And so people started engaging in this. And because at the time research on heroin addiction was in its infancy, people just thought there's no cure for this. And this guy's developed a cure. And literally, states from all over, like, New York sent people, like, this. So this guy founds this facility where basically the treatment is screaming at you. Um, and, so New York State sends people, like California sends, like all over the country. They're like, look, this guy cured heroin addiction. Let's like learn from him. All anecdote, no data. In fact, this is where I have to give props to New Jersey. The only state that did any data gathering on this was New Jersey. And New Jersey was like, okay, let's look at the data. And they're like, oh, gee, what happens is basically 80% of the people who go to this place drop out in the first few weeks. And of the 20% that stay, 85% of those do okay. And so basically, what you're doing is you're selecting for the people who are most motivated to quit. Like, because if you really want to quit, you'll do whatever they tell you. And so but you probably would have done fine anyway.
Yeah.
And so, but by selecting for the natural recovery rate and not counting dropouts as part of your measurements of treatment success, like this, they still do this. Like rehabs all over the country will still say, we've got an 80% success rate with graduates. And it's like, okay, but 80% dropped out in the first 3 weeks and you have to count them. And if you don't count them, that is not a good study. It is known technically as intention to treat analysis. And if you are going to look at any outcome study of anything psychological, you need to look at that. And my silly example of this would be like if you had an antidepressant that caused itching in 99% of people that was unbearable, and you only counted the one person for whom that was not an issue, we would not call this a viable drug.
Yeah.
The FDA would not allow that, right? But in behavioral and mental health care, we allow anecdote to be data all the time. And we end up with this horrific system. So these troubled teen places were sort of modeled on this cult. And for until at least the 80s, about 50% of publicly funded addiction treatment that wasn't methadone, basically, was these places where people scream at you for 18 months. And Synanon wasn't just like a fake cult. They were a full-fledged cult, so much so that basically they started requiring people to swap partners. They required men to get vasectomies. They had women get abortions. They started stockpiling weapons. And when a lawyer started suing them, they took the rattle off a rattlesnake and put it in his mailbox to try to kill him. And so, fortunately, the guy, he did get bit, but his dogs were there and his neighbor was there and he got saved. So the police went to arrest the founder of Synanon, who was obviously this great example of sobriety and recovery, for conspiracy to commit murder by rattlesnake. When they showed up to get him, he was drunk. and so anyway, but like that did not shut Synanon, and that did not end the prevalence of this model called the therapeutic community in the field. Like we still hear, like, now I want to be fair. There is a therapeutic community model that is based in Europe that is different than the American model. But any American program that calls itself a therapeutic community and is for addiction at least originated in the Synanon cult. And like either it originated by like somebody from Synanon came and founded it, or somebody who founded the thing went and studied Synanon, or went and studied someone who had studied at Synanon. This was like enormously prevalent. Any 18-month addiction rehab in the United States from like the 60s through the mid 2000s at least was basically based on this. And so, the 28-day rehabs like the Hazeldens and stuff like that, they also took up some of this for a while. But by the mid 80s, they started realizing that, this may not be such a great idea, that like, oh, wow, like we got a lot of traumatized people here, and re-traumatizing them might not really be the best way to get them into recovery. But there's still a lot of that kind of crap. And there's still an enormous amount of this ridiculous behaviorist stuff that lives in treatments for addiction or depression or any of these residential things for kids. They often have this idea that what you need to do is like, okay, you have to earn X number of points for good behavior, or we'll take away your right to talk to your parents, or we'll, and you can't graduate until you earn X number of points. And oh, gee, this happens to coincide with our financial interests because the longer we stay, the more we get paid.
Of course.
And it's just like nobody learns that way. Like you don't like learn from like if you try to teach me singing by slapping me when I got a wrong note, I'm not really gonna grow as a singer very much. And I'm also probably gonna start to hate singing.
Yeah.
And also, this does not give me any technique. Like, like we don't expect people to learn math by, okay, we're going to punish you if you don't know addition by the end of the day. Like, we recognize that there are skills needed. And similarly with mental health care, there are skills that people who have, most mental illnesses and being on the spectrum involve some kind of emotional dysregulation. And you tend to try to self-medicate that with like, stimming or with drugs or with whatever works for you. And oftentimes what works for you is not the greatest idea. And so you end up in trouble or hurting worse than you were before. So people need skills to be able to develop new ways of coping. And, most people with addiction have either a predisposition to mental illness or severe childhood trauma. More often, severe childhood trauma leads the predisposition to become a mental illness, and then the person self-medicates. So without understanding that, when you're just trying to humiliate people into stopping, which is most of what our treatment has done for a very long time outside of the medication, which was used in a system that's very racist and humiliating in a different way, what people actually need. Addiction is defined as compulsive drug use despite negative consequences. This means that it does not respond to punishment by definition.
Yeah.
So what people need in order to get better is to learn new skills. And that requires wanting to learn new skills and understanding what those skills are and being taught them and making all the mistakes you're going to make because nobody learns anything perfectly at first. Like anything you are trying to learn, you are going to make mistakes and you're not going to be able to get any skills without practicing. And you're going to practice and make mistakes. And then you learn how not to make the mistakes.
Yeah. Something I'm really curious about is I know there are a number of charities, and especially I mentioned, that I also have my music project, and in the music industry, there are a number of charities that work to help musicians, overcome things like addiction, and also, get them access to healthcare and things like that. And I'm hoping that, in the not too distant future, I can be in a place where I can advocate, for better mental health treatment. And I'd really love to know, what would you advise me to say? Like, if I get to a place where I have that access and that platform, what would I say to a really well-meaning music industry charity that is giving their money that they've raised to these rehab centers, like, oh, here's 10K to take care of this
Right.
musician. And
Right.
then, because I've had friends who've gone, and and they weren't helped
I
by the
mean,
rehab. They were helped by what I saw and noticed in them instead. So how would one
I mean,
advocate to a charity and say, maybe your money's not going to the best place?
I think, so there is an organization that is trying to create sort of national quality standards for addiction treatment. I still think they aren't quite there yet, but I do think that understanding that our treatment is not mostly based on evidence and that, 12-step programs are absolutely fabulous for some people, but you can get all the 12-step information and all the 12-step support for free in virtually every church basement in this country. So we shouldn't be paying for 12-step facilitation or for these groups in rehabs that cost $10,000 a day or some, crazy amount of money for what you can get for free. What you should be learning in rehab is you should be getting a complete psychiatric evaluation, which you usually don't get. You should, because figuring out what's underneath the addiction is fundamental. And yes, you're not going to address trauma while somebody's detoxing, although people try. What you want to do is understand what this person's strengths are, what this person's issues are, what's underneath, why this person is using drugs compulsively, and finding alternatives for, and I mean with musicians, like people who are doing music tend to have a meaning and purpose that they get from music, right? But that by itself is not enough. And they will need maybe they have depression that needs medication. Maybe they have childhood trauma and they need to, sort of work through that in various ways. There's a million different reasons that people self medicate. But if you just take away the medication and scream at them and tell them to go to meetings, for a lot of people, that does not work. And for the people who say that screaming at me worked, it worked, well, unless you have 10 identical twins who weren't screamed at, you don't know that that's what worked, right? This is why we don't rely on anecdote for the rest of medicine. The medicine started advancing when we actually did controlled clinical trials and started to try to like see, what works for different people. Like you can't just say like it worked for me, so therefore it will work for you, because that is just not the case. So that's a really difficult question, and I, like, struggle with people all the time who need help, like, where do I send them? And there are starting to be better options, but I think and the sort of whole world of harm reduction is a good place to sort of start with that because, like, that whole idea that, like, we have to meet people where they are and reduce harm first and foremost is especially fundamental when you have a dangerous drug like fentanyl out there or a thing like HIV. What happened when people started taking, doing things like syringe exchange for HIV, they realized that, oh, wow, a lot of what people need is to be heard and be treated respectfully and kindly. And when you start doing that, people are sort of like, oh, well, I really kind of might like to stop this. Like, okay, this is good. I've now, I'm using clean needles now. And so I've got rid of the HIV risk. But, is not really going so great for me. But, the last time I went to treatment, I got screamed at. So, this allows people to get into decent care. And the people who work at these places often know the ways to, the good treatment places and sort of how to help somebody who needs more that, because I mean, what's also interesting with addiction is a lot of people do stop on their own, even from like very severe addiction. And what happens in those circumstances? Well, often they fall in love with somebody, they get a new job, some kind of opportunity opens for them that gives them hope. And they are able to let go of that coping mechanism in a way that they couldn't if they didn't have that help. Now, obviously, this doesn't happen for everyone. And a lot of times people are going to need assistance. But the main thing that people need is to get their chemistry sorted out in their heads, whatever, maybe they need some kind of medication, maybe they need some kind of talk therapy, whatever it is, like whatever that underlying thing is. And then they need a sense of meaning and purpose and a decent life to live. Because if you just like take the drugs away from somebody who, has no education, no job, no house, no relationships, like why would you get sober? like, like people need to have an opportunity to live a life that is good for them from their point of view. And if we don't have people having access to opportunities for that, like you're really going to expect me to give up the only thing that gives me safety and comfort and meaning and purpose for nothing. Like, really?
Yeah, seriously. Those are great. Thank you. I'm gonna revisit this episode in the future when I hopefully one day, have more access and have a voice to be able to advocate in that field. I want to invite Tommy to come on and ask her question. And because we're nearing the end of our episode. So Tommy, do you have a question for Maia today?
Yeah, I was really glad that you brought up Maya's work with the troubled teen industry because that was her work I was first introduced to. And kind of taking this from less of a place of concern and more a place of like almost active hate, I'm having to deal with waves of. I'm frankly wanting to get your opinion on what do we do about the resurgence of conversion therapy coming back in many states, or like I really thought this was going to be a thing of the past as I got older, and now it's coming back with a vengeance, despite more evidence than ever that this doesn't work. So, as someone who's worked in a more generalized setting against these troubled teen camps, what do you recommend people do to push back against something that's so fueled by, frankly,
Well,
bigotry?
the conversion therapy stuff grew out of the awful techniques used in the troubled teen industry. A lot of it did. Now, there's some different strands of it, but there was something, one of the biggest conversion therapy places was based on Straight Incorporated, which was one of the most abusive troubled teen programs. And it directly used the exact same techniques and same people. So we know it was directly related. The best way to counter this, and one of the things, there was a recent Supreme Court decision that, sort of seemed to say that the states can't ban conversion therapy, but it's actually slightly more complicated than that, which is good because there still is room to be able to ban them. And I think, because the Supreme Court sent it down to a lower court. And hopefully, um, you cannot have a standard of care for mental health care if you cannot ban certain ideas, because the standard of care is going to be something like trying to change somebody's gender identity or sexual identity is not going to work. We know that this does not work and it does harm and it has led people to die by suicide. If you're going to have a standard of care, it has to ban things that are harmful. And what we need to be able to fight is this idea that, like, I should be able to say, I'm a therapist and I am using medical care to convert somebody. Like, A, that's not possible. And B, it's harmful. And C, that is not medicine. Like, if you're going to sell something as therapeutic, as medical, as healthcare, as something insurance should cover, you need to meet a standard of care. Otherwise, there is absolutely no point in regulating mental health care in any way, because I can just set up my stand on my head rehab and make a lot of money. And I don't have to prove it works, because I can just get the unmotivated people to not stand on their head enough or whatever I'm doing. So I think this fight isn't lost yet. And I think that even in the courts, it's not lost yet. So I'm hoping to write about this more soon, because I do think that professional speech should be regulated. There is simply no way around that if it's going to be professional speech. Like this woman who wants to provide like conversion therapy, fine. Just don't give her a license. Don't let insurance pay for it. Don't let it be covered, be part of the mental health, get it from your church if that's what you want. You know what I mean? Like you can't offer a therapy that isn't a therapy. Like otherwise the word therapy isn't meaningful. So I'm with you.
Thank you. I'll look forward to seeing some anti-conversion therapy writing, hopefully in the Times. And yeah, I appreciate the encouragement, or at least that glimmer of hope that maybe things are not as black and white as they seem.
Now, I mean, and it is like, I'm not saying it's not bad. I'm just saying that like there is some wiggle room in this decision, such that it may not be as bad as we think. And I think also like over time, people are going to realize that like if mental health care is to mean anything, any kind of talk therapy is to mean anything, you have to be able to regulate it in some way. And if you think that demeaning people is helpful when all we know shows that it's not, you shouldn't be able to sell that. You should be sued for malpractice if you sell that. And that's, what we kind of need to work on.
Yeah, so much treatment out there that, in my opinion, deserves to be sued for malpractice.
I'll just say one more thing on that.
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
We need more lawyers to be able to take these cases. Like one of the best ways to regulate this stuff is to allow something called a private right of action, which basically sicks an army of lawyers on these people. And that way, even if the government doesn't do its job, the lawyers who want to make money will.
Nice. Oh, that is good to know. Definitely that idea that, if we want to call something therapy, it needs to actually be proven to work. Yeah. Which, like as with any therapy, perhaps, is a bad solution to the underlying problem.
We have an FDA for drugs. Who knows how long we will continue to have it, but we do have it now. And the whole point of it is that the thing has to be safe and effective before you can sell it. And I think anything medical, that should be true for. And yes, that makes it difficult with measuring efficacy of talk therapy, but you know what? Do the research.
Amen to that. Thank you again so much, Maia. This has been such a pleasure. I've so enjoyed talking with you. This is, again, it's been like the past 10 years that your work has informed my work. And to be able to talk with you here and have these conversations, and there's a million more things that I could go on about too. I barely got even to like half of the points that I had written down, but this was such a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I am such a fan of your work. So thank you for being here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And this has been the Repatterning Podcast. So stay tuned and we'll see you next time. Go forth and repattern. Thank you for listening to the Repatterning Podcast. If you're curious about the Repatterning Project, the 8-week course in mental mastery and creative freedom that inspires these conversations, you can check out more details at therepatterningproject.com. We run a cohort twice a year, or you can download the self-study version of the course and get started today. We also offer a 4-week course on narrative magic and archetype titled Myths and Magic, Changing Your Life Through Story, also twice a year. If you'd like to join our community, the Repatterning Parlor, on Discord, you can sign up for $5 a month at patreon.com/the-repatterning-podcast. Thanks to everyone who makes the Repatterning Podcast possible. Firstly, our award-winning producer, Tommy Trembath of the Keymaster Collective network of podcasts. She also produces Transcending Comics, Vision in the Void, and Giant-Sized Violence. Thanks also to animation studio Mortis and Madriax, who created the video for our introduction, as well as to Andrew Means, who composed and produced our theme music. And also thanks to Al Alvarez, who took the photos of yours truly that you see on the cover of each episode if you're watching the video version. And finally, thanks to you, our listeners, who give meaning to this work. Our greatest wish is that whatever you've heard today inspires you to live freely and begin creating your reality from the inside out. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.